Hello and welcome to another edition of another book review. This week I'll be reviewing Chuck Klosterman's Football. I'll talk very briefly about the author, go into an overview about what the book is, talk about what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, who I'd recommend the book to, and I think we'll finish there. I'm not sure exactly what I'll be reading for next time. Chuck Klosterman is a writer who I've reviewed on the channel before. I reviewed his 90s, the book The 90s. I will leave that below. He's a cultural commentator and writer, has been writing for publishing stuff for almost 30 years now. He usually is known for writing essays, usually about pop culture. This is a little bit different in that I think it's the first book that he is writing about cultural events from different angles. He wrote a book called Killing Yourself to Live, which is about him visiting, was more of a travelogue, and him visiting places where people had died related to rock and roll and music in general. But I think this is the first time that I can recall where it's kind of single subject that he was looking at things from a different angle. The 90s is obviously something of a history of the 1990s. This is about football, American football, mostly pro football, but a little bit of some heavy time devoted to college football, as well as a little bit of time devoted to the CFL, Canadian Football League. Um, and kind of, if you've read Chuck Klosterman in the past, many of his trademarks are really here. He has a very kind of distinct writing style that has not changed. He is very funny. I found the book to be laugh out loud funny at parts. And it's a collection of essays, so some of the essays are going to probably strike your fancy a little bit more than others. The highlights for me were the essays on who is the greatest football player of all time and how do you determine who the greatest football player of all time is, and he kind of goes through a series of arguments that have changed over the years, and I thought that was really well done. A lot of the essays include like his own personal relationship to certain football games or football players, and I thought that was surprisingly emotional. I thought that he had a chapter on football coaches that I also thought was really well done. Um, and the where he's talking about how would you explain the popularity of football to someone, I thought that was good, and that was really about how the marriage of television and football were kind of a perfect match. Some of the things that I found a little bit not as inviting. He has certain quirks that he's had for a very long time that I can recognize from when I read What If We're Wrong, where he'll just kind of throw out an assertion, and for someone who maybe is more of a casual fan of football, and that's kind of what I would consider myself. I'm certainly by no means a hardcore fan. I don't watch football particularly that often, and I know what I know about it kind of from second and third hand sources from the media when I'm reading things. I'm much more um, knowledgeable about the culture of football than I am really about like the actual day to day games. So sometimes they'll just like throw out assertions for things like, like most people who watch both, I prefer the college game, and you're like waiting for like, well, why is that? And maybe that's something that's self evident to people who are fans of both. But as someone who's more of a casual person, was curious as to why that was, and he doesn't go into kind of explicit detail on some of the stuff. The flaw that I found in the book was that for me, uh, I felt that there are probably two or three, maybe even four chapters of things that just I did not think needed to be in the book. He has, and they mostly come towards the end. There's a book chapter on why we call football football and why football is football in America. Soccer is football everywhere else, and that chapter really didn't do anything for me. There's a chapter on the Canadian Football League I think he could have also cut, and I didn't think the book overall was that long. It's like 275 pages, but I think he could have used those extra pages to go a little bit deeper into some of the subjects. He has a chapter about race where he talks about, I believe Christian McCaffrey is the player who's a very talented white running back, and he uses this as a springboard to talk about race and racism in the NFL. He talks about briefly the Colin Kaepernick um, situation where he was refusing to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I thought there were some facts that he kind of elided over that could have been a more robust discussion, or pointed point of view. How do I say this? A more nuanced point of view of that thing, I think, could have been useful, and I think he could have needed time to kind of build up in terms of the chapter on race, and I think he could have used more pages to expand on that argument, because ultimately I don't really know what he's left with. He mentioned several times in that essay it makes him uncomfortable, and ultimately I don't know what to take away from that was. I think that there's also a chapter on what is ultimately going to end football, which is what most of the media has been surrounding this book has been talking about. He's done a lot of press for it. And I think what I'm going to do is I think I'm going to create a podcast. I have another podcast. I'm going to probably leave a link to that episode below when I record it. But his argument is basically at some point in the future, football will have grown so large that the revenue has to kind of keep coming in, and he points to the games that were played during COVID, and he foresees something happening around maybe a little bit after mid-century, where in advertising dollars start to dry up because companies realize that advertising is not a really valid way to reach consumers anymore. It's certainly not worth the money they spend, and so this begins to shrink the revenue pool from the broadcasting rights, and this in turn will shrink the league and shrink salaries. And he basically kind of sees a point where there is a conflict between the players and the owners that they can't resolve, and this kind of injures the game of football. I think that was an essay he really could have used some extra space, because there's sometimes he'll say he had several kind of arguments I thought were plausible arguments, but I think he kind of needed to bring a little bit more concrete to the argument and kind of go maybe one level deeper on some of the stuff. I thought his view of advertisement is not necessarily that the view on advertisement was wrong. It was just, in my opinion, kind of overly simplistic. There are other reasons that anybody who's in marketing advertising will point to as to reasons that companies advertise other than kind of product launches. And yeah, so that's kind of my issue with the book. I think he could have gone a little bit deeper on a couple of these chapters. The chapters that he has, I did enjoy. Like I said, there was a personal touch to that. And stories, when he kind of went personal about these being kind of connected to his life, I found that to be moving. He also spends a pretty healthy chunk earlier in the book about football in Texas and how that's different than football in other places, and I thought that was also a strong chapter. Who would I recommend the book to? I would recommend this book to people who are fans of Chuck Klosterman, and if you are a fan of football, I think that you will enjoy this. If you're kind of familiar at all with like sports writing, there was nothing in this book that I found to be something I'm going to be thinking about a year or two from now. But if you're looking to kill a couple hours or something on a plane, I think it's a good book. I think, like I said, there are a couple of essays I would probably recommend to just anybody because I think the writing on it's very good. I think the essay on why football will come to an end is like kind of the monocultural juggernaut that it is. I thought that was interesting, if nothing else, to maybe have people see how these arguments are built, because I don't think that is writing that's done. I don't think that is taught particularly well. So it is something of a persuasive essay, and if you are trying to teach someone how to write a persuasive essay, my personal opinion is that there are some things that are a little implausible about the essay, but if you're trying to teach someone how to do it, I think that you could do a lot worse if you're trying to tie something, especially into something that people know already. And I think it's kind of a fun thought experiment, even besides that. So I thought that essay, while I kind of come to the same conclusions from a different angle, I thought it was interesting. And he kind of goes into the history of horse racing and boxing, and how if you looked 100 years ago, or at this point, more than 100 years ago, the turn into the 20th century, those were the biggest sports in the world, or sports in America, and why that was, and the connection between the sports and human beings, and it kind of the reflection of the culture that was there, in the same way that football is kind of a reflection of the culture that we have now, and why he feels that kind of cultural values are changing that may make football less appealing as time goes on. So I thought that made sense. How he gets there is a little bit rocky, but I think that's it for now. I will go ahead and leave my Twitter link below, as well as my review of the 90s. I'm going to, like I said, probably finish this podcast up later this weekend. So probably by the end of Sunday, I'll probably have that link if folks are interested. This is 4:11, so probably by midnight 4:12. If you're interested in learning if you've read football and you know the essay that I'm talking about, and you're interested to hear another take on what another possible route that someone could imagine where football kind of comes to an end as a cultural juggernaut. I agree with what he says. He basically says, football is like the Second Amendment. It's never going away. But I think his argument is it'd probably be something similar to where baseball or basketball are now, which is to say it's one of the 3 or 4 major sports, but it's not heads and shoulders above everything else the way it is now. So, yeah. Thank you for watching this, and until next time, bye.